Welcome to this final section of the online Ethics and Moral Issues course. We're going to be finishing this course by discussing utilitarianism and the people who have objected to utilitarianism in the contemporary period. So this really brings us to stuff that's very, very current. So we'll be talking about Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, Peter Singer, John Rawls. Now, Bentham and Mill were alive in the 1800s, the late 1800s. So Mill is writing in the 1860s, 1850s. Peter Singer is currently still alive and teaches at Princeton. And John Rawls used to teach at Harvard, and he died very recently, not too long ago. So this will really bring us into the contemporary period of ethical thinking. And this really starts with Jeremy Bentham, who endorses straightforwardly a kind of what's called hedonism. And hedonism is simply means that pleasure is the highest good. So Bentham agrees that ethics is the science of achieving happiness. So if you want to put that in Aristotelian terms, but whereas happiness for Aristotle was a kind of activity, a kind of a style of life, a rational, an activity of reason and developing virtues and so on. For Bentham and Mill, happiness is pleasure. And there are two kinds of hedonism corresponding to the two kinds of egoism which we talked about earlier. So there's a psychological hedonism and an ethical hedonism. Now, psychological hedonism is the claim that all human actions are motivated by seeking pleasure or avoided pain. So that, again, is just a descriptive claim. It isn't a normative claim. What it says is, as a matter of fact, every human action is motivated by seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. Now, of course, ethical hedonism isn't a descriptive claim, it's a normative claim. And the claim here is that pleasure is itself the only thing which is intrinsically valuable. And therefore our actions ought to be motivated by seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. So ethical hedonism and psychological hedonism, this should be old hat to you given what our long discussion of egoism early in the semester. Now, Bentham and Mill endorse both of these claims. Not all utilitarians do. Later ones start to wonder if they can reject hedonism and then what can they put in its place. But we'll discuss that later. Okay, so Bentham and Mill both think that it's only the consequences of an action that matter for determining whether or not that action is good or not. So that's why this view is called utilitarianism, because they think that what's good is what has utility, the consequences, what you produce by your actions. So that's what should be promoted then, is what has utility. Now, since they both accept that pleasure is the one intrinsic good, they both endorse something they call the greatest happiness principle, which is supposed to be the kind of categorical inversion, it's supposed to be the categorical imperative for utilitarians. So the greatest happiness principle says that an action is right insofar as it promotes the greatest amount of happiness, which is pleasure, for the greatest amount of sentient beings. Now, notice right off the bat that this is not a form of egoism, because it's not saying that one ought to maximize one's own happiness. So that's why this is psychological egoism ethical egoism is a different theory than utilitarianism, because the ethical egoist thinks that they have to maximize their own self-interest. And so if they were also a hedonist, then they would think they should maximize their own pleasures. But the utilitarian is someone who thinks that what needs to be maximized is not individual pleasures, but the happiness of all of those things which are capable of feeling happiness. So that's what I was just saying. It's the happiness of everyone that matters. And notice how it's sentient beings here. So any being that's capable of feeling pleasure or pain is one whose pleasures and pains are going to figure in to moral calculations. Now, in considering whether an action is good, we must consider how much pleasure it would produce along 7 dimensions, according to Bentham. So we've got to consider the intensity of the pleasure or the pain, how intense it is, how long it will last, how certain one is that it will occur. If there's only a 50% probability that you'll get this pleasure as opposed to getting some pain, that's not as good as if there's a 95% chance that you'll get this pleasure as opposed to that pain. How soon it will occur, all things being equal, having pleasure sooner is better than having pleasure later. Now, some pleasures lead to additional pleasures. So getting one may get you several. So you've got to consider what this pleasure is going to lead to, whereas some pleasures lead to additional pains. So you've got to consider what getting this pleasure will lead to. And of course, whether it's mixed with any pain. So obviously one wants pure pleasures, but sometimes they come mixed with pain, so we have to consider that. And of course, the thing that so far, all of this is something that the egoist could agree with, but of course, as we were just saying, the thing that really distinguishes utilitarianism from egoism is how many people it affects. And of course, people here is used loosely, not in the Kantian sense of a rational being, but of as an organism capable of experiencing pleasure and pain. So now Bentham coined a term that he called a hedon, which was a unit of pleasure or pain. So basically what he envisioned was a sort of mathematical procedure whereby one could tally up the various hedons and then do some calculation and find out which actions produced more overall hedons than other actions, and that would determine then which actions were moral, excuse me, and which actions were not moral. Very simply, ethics reduces to a kind of calculation, and this is again was very exciting for people who, in the late 19th century, in the 1870s and so on, because here seemed to be a way to make ethics scientific, more like science. It was no longer like Kant had envisioned it, deducing the a priori moral truth via the use of reason. Here is an empiricist version of ethics, whereby in order to determine whether something is right or wrong, what we do is we go and investigate the world and see how much pain and how much pleasures are produced by various actions, and that determines whether they're right or wrong, good or bad. Now notice what's important here and what's really doing a lot of the work for grounding the greatest happiness principle is Bentham's idea that each person's pleasure counts as one and nobody counts as more than one. So a pleasure is a pleasure, a pain is a pain. Whether it's in me or whether it's in you, it's equally bad to the person that has it. So I can't give any reason, Bentham argues, why it would be the case that my pleasures are more important than your pleasures. What reason could I give? Well, that they're mine? That doesn't seem to be any kind of reason whatsoever. Now, notice that this applies to animals as well. Animals, insofar as they experience pain, experience something which is intrinsically bad. And insofar as they experience pleasure, they experience something which is intrinsically good. So the greatest happiness principle says you have to take in their suffering into account when we're thinking about moral issues, dramatically opposed to the way that Kantian moral theory deals with animals. Okay, so according to the utilitarian then, No action is intrinsically good or bad. If the consequences are good, then the action is good. If the consequences are bad, then the action is bad. But you can't say of an action, murder for instance, you can't say beforehand whether it's morally good or morally bad. It's totally determined by the consequences that the action has. So now this has the right result, a lot of people feel, in cases of the lying to the murderer. So to determine whether lying is morally good or not, we need to determine what the consequences of lying are. And if there are cases where lying has good consequences, then the utilitarian will argue lying is morally good in those circumstances. So our murderer at the door scenario that we've been discussing, whereas the Kantian has to say lying is always bad, it's intrinsically bad because of its nature, because of the formal nature of the action itself. It can't be universalized consistently without contradiction. Because of that, lying is intrinsically immoral, and there are no cases where it counts as a morally good action, according to the Kantian. Well, the utilitarian has a straightforward counterposition to this. Their position is that the lie in and of itself is a neutral action. It's what the result of the lie is that determines whether it's morally good or morally bad. So if lying saves a person's life, that's a morally good action. If you're merely lying to avoid some responsibility, then that's a bad action. Okay, so let's look at some actual examples because it will help us see what's going on here. So suppose that you're in a lifeboat, and in this lifeboat you have, on the one hand, a healthy, happy dog that's jumping around, making everyone in the boat more relaxed and calmer, and the dog's got the Alpo glow and looks very healthy. Now, on the other hand, suppose that you have an unhappy, unhealthy, elderly person who's causing everyone to be upset. So this person's moaning about their arthritis, they're moaning about how everyone's going to die, they're sure of it, they're saying death is coming, there's no escape, there's no hope, they're wailing, gnashing their teeth, making everyone on the boat nervous. The dog, on the other hand, is jumping around, licking people, causing them oh so temporarily to forget their troubles. Now, of course, as in all of these scenarios, someone's got to go, so there's not enough room in the boat. And the question is, who do we sacrifice, right? Now, someone's got to be sacrificed. And the two natural candidates are the dog, well, because it's a dog, and the elderly person, well, because they're elderly, and it probably is least objectionable if they die. So the question is, who are we going to throw overboard? Well, straightforward Bentham-style utilitarianism would have us throw overboard the elderly person. Because what you're trying to do is just calculate which action produces the most happiness overall, the most amount of pleasure and the least amount of suffering. And every pleasure and every pain is counted equally, the same. There's no weighting. So you can't say, well, it's a dog's pleasure, so it's less importance. You can't say, well, it's a human's pleasure, so it's more importance. You can't say, well, even though this person is making us unhappy, it's more important that we save their life than the dog's life. So Bentham and his form of utilitarianism seem committed in this kind of scenario to tossing over the human. And that's because Bentham held that the pleasures were pleasures. And as he puts it in his famous quote, which was often bandied about, pushpin is as good as poetry. Now, you probably don't know what pushpin is. In fact, I didn't know what pushpin was when I first started studying this stuff. And you have to remember that, of course, Bentham is writing in the 1800s. So pushpin was a popular child's game which existed at that time. I discovered after Googling it. So something comparable would be our modern game of jacks, perhaps, or marbles, if people still play marbles, I'm not sure, or hopscotch, or foursquare, or, pick some activity that children engage in on the playground. And that's what he means by pushpin. So, what he's trying to get at here is that whether the pleasure is produced by a child's game or by the metaphor and analogy of a beautiful poem, don't factor in to whether the pleasure's valuable or not. If it's a pleasure, it's a pleasure, and it's the same pleasure, Bentham thinks, that's produced by childlike games, and it's the same pleasure that's produced by intellectual activities like understanding metaphor and analogy, and so on. So in this case, it looks like we have no reason that we can, according to the utilitarian, that we can appeal to save the person as opposed to the dog, right? The dog's just producing more happiness. The elderly person's making everyone else unhappy, and the dog's happiness is just as important as us, so it looks like we have to throw the elderly person should go.